As a man, I want to be responsible, able to handle my business and take care of my family.
Some of us are hardworking, true leaders in society and positive role models to youths of this generation.
A father is the blueprint of a man to his sons and daughters.
As a young man, I want to be a leader who leads by example.
Many men care for their family and want to protect and provide for them.
We have to ask ourselves the question, am I comfortable in functioning in my capacity as a role model and exemplar to my family and the community?
Well, I'm the firstborn, only boy to Adita and Prasad Kisoon. I'm the oldest brother to Nalini Kisoon. I think from birth that has become the journey of who Marcus Kisoon is, being influenced by a self-employed father who is a welder and an accountant, mother, growing up in the northern part of Trinidad and Tobago, going to school in the northeast, well, more the east. I think that is where Marcus Kisoon really started to learn what he wants, who he is, what he wants to be, and I think I had a regular, usual childhood, mom, dad, domestic problems, again, which seems to be a Caribbean family issue, responsibility as a brother, and the struggles of just being a boy, especially a boy who went to an all-boys school. You know, just having to maintain and keep up with the ideas and ideologies of what it means to be a man, and then how do you become a person in a space like that. All of those have really shaped my confidence, my ability to perform, and my ability to want to give back. I was the last batch of persons to write common entrance, and when I wrote common entrance, the day of the results, when I came out of collecting that piece of slip, the very traumatizing piece of slip, the one person who was outside was my father. My father, for 7 years, never came to a PTA, never came to a fundraiser, may have probably dropped me to school twice in those 7 years, may have prepared me for school twice in those 7 years, and I think that moment of him being there, whether it was for his own self-reassurance as a father to know his son has passed common entrance, whatever his reason being, the impact of him being present was so memorable, was so emotional, and has been one of the memories of him that will stay with me. Question. So, one, we have to acknowledge the fact that child sexual abuse does exist, and that women and girls continuously become primarily the high prevalence cases that exist globally as well as nationally. However, I have to acknowledge the fact that boys are affected by child sexual abuse differently. At this point in time, I'm not so concerned about the numbers. I'm concerned about the experiences that masculinity put on boys and femininity put on girls. Let's talk a little bit more about how masculinity affects boys. There are numbers, there are stories out there. The Sean Lukes and the Akil Chambers are realities to tell us that boys are affected by child sexual abuse. However, the way in which they are affected continuously are embedded in the way that they perform and execute and how society values masculinity. So, for example, my research looks at Indo-Caribbean male survivors of child sexual abuse. Now, one, men don't feel as though they have a place to disclose because one, they're not going to be believed, right? Reason being is that society has put an idea about manhood that men are supposed to be strong, see about themselves, more so be emotionless. Hence the reason why it's not a problem for boys, right? Secondly, we live in a very homophobic society. Being penetrated as a man feminizes the crime. No man wants to acknowledge the fact that they have been affected by a crime that is predominantly for women. Right? So homophobia has silenced men. The feminization of child sexual abuse has silenced men. And the fact that we expect men to constantly be taking care of themselves physically, aggressively, and emotionlessly has caused boys to continue to be silent. From the experiences I've had, society expects girls to be victims of sexual assault. It's almost as though they're prepared for that kind of dynamic. So I think we're in a space where we are a little bit more comfortable with the resources and the services that should be allocated to girls. However, in a Caribbean context, we don't have the language, the gender language for boys, and boys in this particular type of victimhood. So I do think that there's a particular kind of barrier around discussing your boy child being a victim of sexual assault. So I had some free time in university when I went to USC, and I just wanted to give back. I just wanted to volunteer, do something with my extra time. So the first place that accepted me as a volunteer was the Rape Crisis Center, which I'm now 11 years still a member of. And it was a struggle because it was a very female-dominated space, and two things happened. Is either men weren't taken seriously because we were seen as the perpetrator, or we were given extra privilege because there were a lack of voices of men. So I saw the both dichotomy. Being young also played a huge problem, and people thought I was also naive. So just to let you know about the experience there. But yeah, I started volunteering. The first year was a struggle because I was like, what is this little Indian know about, grew up in a privileged home, have no experience of child sexual abuse. Why am I here, right? I had the pressures of being asked constantly, are you a victim? Because it's as though men can't be allies, they could only be perpetrators or victims, right? So being an ally, a wanting conscious ally, was new for a lot of people, especially myself. I had to negotiate what does that look like, because I wasn't speaking as a victim or with that experience, but I was just a genuinely concerned young man who wanted to give back. And as years went by, I learned so much about femininity, the women's movement, the struggles of the women's movement, the lack of resources, the discrimination that affects women. And that created a platform for me for when one day a dear friend of mine decided to disclose his abuse to me. We were just playing video games one day and he was like, so and so happened to me. And I was like, wow, this is someone who you shared a classroom with, who you play with, who you argue with. And I was like, wow, for all these years, I was focused on trying to protect the girl child and women, right? And I'm like, but what system is there for men? Because the same way in which he came forward to tell me is definitely not the same way women would have come forward with me, right? Or with the other girlfriends or other women, or it was just different. The way he disclosed, I felt as though there was a certain level of trust and togetherness that was needed amongst men for them to come forward. And that was the start of me starting to interrogate, investigate, and develop a consciousness around male survivors of child sexual abuse. So in 2013, I went to a fellowship in the US where I worked for the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault, which I spent my time there investigating the male victim and the dynamics around male victims and the approaches that society need to take in order to provide a certain level of care, understanding, inclusion of male survivors. And from 2013 to now, I have dedicated my work using a feminist platform, using a feminist methodology, using my knowledge of the women's movement to include this subordinated masculine issue. Because men who are raped fall short to the alpha male, right? Hence the reason why the topic isn't taken seriously. He is not seen as the ideal man. He is not seen as a man who lives up to the expectations of society. So understanding that power dynamic, understanding the lack of respectability that male survivors are given because of my feminist knowledge and platform to dismantle power, I see the need to raise the consciousness around men, and a different kind of inclusion is needed. Shame and embarrassment are just language of feelings based on a situation, right? Shame and embarrassment on a superficial level does exist for both women and men, but the gender realities of the embarrassment are too different. Women are shamed and embarrassed because they are blamed for their bodies, right? Men are silenced and shamed and embarrassed because they didn't live up to being this masculine man to take care of themselves. We expect men to always be ready to fight, to be ready to take care of themselves, to be emotionless. Something not supposed to bother man, right? You're not supposed to be sad about something, right? And that shame stems from the idea of not being able to live up to the hegemonic masculine ideal. So we put these heavy ideals on our boy children, because something to note is that in my experience with working with male survivors of child sexual abuse, the same expectations of being a masculine man at an adult age is the same expectations we put on these boys, because the same rationale for why my research participants, through my thesis, the same reason why they said that they didn't tell their story is the same reason why older boys and men who were assaulted didn't tell their stories, right? They didn't feel as though that one, they would have been believed, that they were man enough, that they let down their parents in being a boy, right? And then the whole idea of what sexual orientation and the confusion around that may look like. Only through being around persons who are affected, who didn't come with the same amount of privilege that I have, so like women, members of the LGBT community, persons with disabilities, only then I was able to raise a particular kind of consciousness, understanding around one, your privilege, right? People, more so men, have to acknowledge the privilege in which they exist in, right? And this privilege is simply being able to walk the streets on a different level from women, right? Being able to access certain things faster, not having their bodies objectified like women. That kind of privilege is something that we have to first introspectively deal with. When you acknowledge that, then you're truly willing to come to a situation and focus on it, and not speak from a place of, oh well, that never happened to me, or I could get past that, right? That is something I would love my brethren and them to get past. It's not what you could do, but it's what you could do and be understanding to others, which leads to another part, which is accountability. We need to hold accountability, for me, on two levels. On the value level, because if you value sexual assault as a crime of power and control, then you're not going to use it in everyday life. You're not going to do it with your employees. You're not going to do it with your daughters. You're not going to do it with your sons. You're not going to hold power and control over animals. We acknowledge that rape continues to be a crime of power and control, where I want to take power over you. It's very little around with sexual gratification, right? However, if you are aiming to challenge that mindset of power and control, it has to be across the board. You don't want to take power and control over children and women's bodies, then you don't want to take control over your employees. You don't want to take power over them. You don't want to show that you're the dominating one, right? You don't want to do that with your niece. You don't want to do that with the stray animals on the street, right? That's how you hold accountability to your value. Right? You just can't stand up and say, I am against sexual assault. You understand? And then you have to be accountable in your programmatics, right? You can't go out there and say that you're fighting sexual abuse for boys to get back at the women's movement, or because you feel it's a topic that needs to be dealt with, and you want to hold somebody else accountable for it. If you are fighting the cause, hold yourself accountable to the cause, right? That is how I function. I do pass blame, or I don't shift blame. There's a cause. I dig deeper into the reality of it, and I share the knowledge and I raise the consciousness about it. And that's the best I could do, and that's how I hold myself accountable. I account for where my knowledge comes from. If I get funds, I hold that accountable too. We know how that works. If I have an objective to meet, I show how I meet that objective, right? And I think that is how we move forward with these issues. I think I've always argued that gender and sexuality language is young in the Caribbean. I mean, the institute is only like 25 years old, right, in terms of creating scholarships and knowledge around gender in the region. I think that limited knowledge needs to be challenged. It needs to be dealt with. Parents need to understand the fact that these are issues relating to body parts, sex, engagement, safety, and if parents aren't able to have that conversation or create a space in the home where that conversation could be had, then children aren't going to come forward if they're being affected, or learn what it means to be safe, what it means to say no, what it means to understand what is right from wrong when it comes to their bodies, right? Because you're not going to be in your children's lives 24 hours. However, you could be in your children's conversations, and your children could bring their spaces to you. From where I started, from where I am now, I'm seeing a sort of an evolution of the crime, where technology now continues to play a role in the way how victims are found, how disclosure comes forward. So we're seeing different nuances, right, for us. That's a good thing about being in the US at that point in time, is that what I saw then is actually coming to light now. I would like to see a sort of a rigorous consciousness constantly around children's safety and children's centeredness, right? We can't have a sexual offences act and expect it to work for the next 20 years, right? These nuances will be coming up, and as they come up, I think we need to be addressing them. I think the Children's Task Force should have been, or something similar to a Children's Task Force, which one could argue is the Children's Authority now, should be in a constant conversation around what next to better the lives of our children, right? There's no more vulnerable than the innocence of children, if you ask me, right? The way we treat children talks about what we want as a society, right? And I want to see more children-centeredness around everything, right? From the way the education system is developed, from the way housing distributes things. I want to see children in the conversation, not just as a present around the table, but the needs of children to be constant.